Right then, this is media psychology. This is going to be all about how the media influences our social behaviour. So we're going to be starting off today by having a look at media influences on pro-social behaviour. So the reason we look at this, I've got a little quote here: if violence on TV causes people to be more aggressive, then shouldn't the good-hearted qualities in TV cause its audience to be kinder to each other? Obviously, what you've probably heard of about this in the media is people copying violent video games and all of that. That's had a lot of publicity. But the first thing we're going to actually look at is if you put like good messages and people doing good things on TV, will that mean that people copy them? So that's the big question for today. And yeah, what pro-social behaviour is, here's a definition for you: voluntary actions that are intended to help or benefit another individual or group of individuals. So it's talking about the consequences of their actions, not the motivations. So voluntary actions that will help other people. And we're going to be asking four main questions about this area. Firstly, how much exposure do children actually get to pro-social behaviour? Obviously, there is lots of cartoons and things where people, fight and all of that. So we want to look at how many positive messages really come through the media. And then how much of an effect do pro-social lessons actually have on children or on adults? Like, is there any point putting them in? Are they actually effective? What difference does age make? Are children more affected by pro-social messages, or is it teenagers or even maybe adults? So that's another question. And then what is the role of parents? So a number of these questions we'll look at as part of the evaluation. And I'm only actually going to take you through the AO1 as part of this video. We're going to do the AO2 in the lesson. So we're going to be focusing probably mainly on the first two, the exposure and the effect. So we'll start with exposure here. So we've got a few studies here. The first one, Greenberg did a content analysis of children's programs in the US and found an equivalent number, so 50-50 pro-social and anti-social. This is 1980, so obviously media has come on. This is 20 years ago, so it's worth bearing that in mind. 1999, slightly more modern, 77% of US programs for preschool children contained at least one pro-social lesson. That's a bit more of a positive study. But only 4 of the top 20 most TV programs for under 17s contained any pro-social lessons. So we've got like a 50-50, a good study and a bad study, if you want to put it that way. So there's probably more research needed, particularly like in other cultures and so on, about how much exposure and more up to date. Now, if we look at how this actually takes any effect, we're going to think a little bit about social learning theory. Now, you've already studied Bandura's study, where children basically copied aggressive behaviour after seeing an adult, and we've talked about social learning theory, but the suggestion is that is how this is occurring, how pro-social messages are absorbed from the media. So here's our question: how do we actually adopt pro-social views from the media? And if we talk about social learning theory, you remember it's got several stages. So the first stage was attention. We had retention, reproduction, motivation. Remember the ARM model, we went through this before. So in the first stage, we've got models that we identify with on TV, for example, attractive ones and so on. You have to pay attention to them. Retention, you have to memorize the behaviors observed. Reproduction, you reproduce the observed behavior if you have to have the ability to reproduce it. So we're thinking particularly about obviously positive behaviours. Do we have the ability and the skill to reproduce it? And then motivation, remember you've got your vicarious reinforcement, which acts as motivation to imitate. So obviously in the media, if someone does something positive, normally the the consequences for them will be positive, so that's indirect vicarious reinforcement. But equally, if you watch someone do something positive on the media and you reproduce it and you have positive consequences, that's direct reinforcement. So there we go. So that's kind of the idea of how we actually adopt it from the media. So that's just a little summary of it. We're more likely to be rewarded for repeating prosocial acts. So in theory, prosocial messages should have a greater effect in theory, because the consequences, both vicariously and directly, are likely to be more positive and more rewarding. So if we start to think about research that's been done, we've got a few studies. This is quite a nice study. This was by a guy called Sprafkin, and he had 6-year-olds watch an episode of Lassie. It's quite sweet. They watched a puppy rescue scene, then there was a second group which watched a scene with no rescue, and then a third group watched a completely separate show. So all the children then, they played a game where they could win a prize, and they, as kind of part of this game, while they were playing it, they came across some distressed puppies. And the children who'd watched the puppy rescue scene in Lassie spent lots of time comforting them, even though it meant that they didn't win the prize. So the idea is that that's like a nice altruistic behaviour. Having kind of watched someone rescue a puppy, they're then imitating that behaviour, even at cost to themselves. So that suggests that watching a helpful model can create a social norm which encourages pro-social behaviour. So that's an example of where we've seen the effect of pro-social media in action in a study. And then another key piece of research was Mares, and he reviewed a whole load of research, and there were basically 4 things that he picked out of them. And the first was anti-stereotyping, and the idea behind this was that if you showed children programs which were against stereotyping, like they showed things about different sexes and so on, they became less prejudiced about the other sex, for example. So you've got anti-stereotyping was the first effect. Then another one was positive interaction. They found was an effect of pro-social media. If you show children pro-social media, they were much more likely to have friendly interactions, help other people resolve arguments and so on when they were playing. Altruism, so Sprafkin, that study with the puppies is the key example of that one. And self-control, modelled by programs. So if you'd had a program that modelled self-control and like resilience, then they found, several studies found that children were more likely to show those different features. And then this is another kind of key study. We've got lots of research here, that's why we're kind of doing it like this. So Howard and Roberts investigated the effects of children's TV, and they showed toddlers Teletubbies. And they found, it sounds quite sweet actually, the children were like joining in with the actions. If they were there with other toddlers, they would like smile at each other and point to the screen, and they'd go up to the TV set and talk to the characters. And so they concluded that actually children were learning useful things from pro-social media that were a big part of socialization. So they were learning about different emotions, and they were empathizing with them and trying to interact with them. So they're finding quite positive effects from media. And another thing, this is to do with age. This is the media, looking at pro-social effects of media and how they change with age. The suggestion is that because our empathy and our moral reasoning and all of that all develop through childhood into adolescence, if you think about how you've developed since you were a small child, actually now you're a lot more capable of empathy than you were as a child. You've probably thought a lot more about morals and what's right and what's wrong. and actually that should mean that you're more affected by prosocial messages in media than young children, because you're more able to kind of take it in and mull over it and consider its message. So in theory, it should be just reinforcing what you've already decided. So in theory, young children should be less affected. We'll look at what the actual research says for our AO2. And this was the last question that we were going to ask about, was parental, what role do parents play in this whole thing? And there are two studies here, and the first one, Austin, found that actually it was really important for a parent to discuss any programs that they'd watched with their child, and the second study found that actually really young children could even understand really complex messages as long as parents were involved. So the suggestion here is that parents do play quite an important role in helping children interpret prosocial messages in the media, and that if they do that, the children are much more likely to take on board or even reproduce the prosocial messages that they've seen. So that is your AO1 for this area.